Hello everybody, welcome to this video in the series of videos on a safety inventory. So this week we're talking about the impact of aggregation on safety inventory. So in the last video we talked about what are the pros and cons of having a single distribution center versus multiple distribution centers. In this video we'll talk more about other issues that come up with the idea of aggregation, right? So one of the first thing that we'll talk about is the idea of specialization. So let's say that you have a situation where you have inventory that is carried at multiple locations. One of the questions, so the question that we answered before was, should we aggregate all of them into a single distribution center or should we have separate distribution centers, right? But what if you can aggregate some of them into a single distribution center, but then you can have some of the other items that are not in a single distribution center but are located at each of the individual distribution centers, right? So maybe centralize some and decentralize the other. So how should we do that, right? So here's a simple example of, we'll see a simple example of that in a second. This will be based upon something called the coefficient of variation. Coefficient of variation is the ratio of standard deviation to average demand. So what is the standard deviation of demand? And you divide that by the average value of demand, it gives you the coefficient of variation. So if coefficient of variation is high, so let me quickly show you the formula again. We briefly saw that in the video that I made last time. So here, if you look at this, so the coefficient of variation is the standard deviation divided by the average value of demand. So if coefficient of variation is high, it means that your demand has a very high variation. This is true for items that don't move very quickly. So sometimes they might have very low demand, sometimes they might have very high demand. So if they're not quick moving items, they're not continuously used items, then the coefficient of variation will be high. So if items have a low coefficient of variation, it is because most likely because the standard deviation is low, right? And this is true for items that move quickly, like say salt or toilet paper and things like that. They have very low coefficient of variation. But if you have things like jewelry, for example, they'll have very high coefficient of variation. So coefficient of variation plays a big role in determining the trade-offs of when should you centralize versus when you shouldn't centralize, right? It sort of kind of makes sense to have a single repository for all toilet paper, which you can send to your different centers, then quickly replenish your different centers, versus jewelry, where you should probably hold different types of jewelry at all your different centers because you don't know who might come to buy which sort of style at each of your different locations, right? So here we have two examples. One is a car motors and the other is a cleaner for the car, right? So here you'll notice that the weekly demand per store is 20. So on an average, you only sell 20 of these, and the standard deviation is 40, which means that there's a huge variation. The coefficient of variation is 2. 40 divided by 20, that's coefficient of variation is 2. As opposed to cleaners, where the mean demand is 1000, standard deviation is 100, a very low coefficient of variation of 0.1. So you doing the usual calculation that we do, if you're looking at individual stores, the safety inventory that you need to hold per store is 132, while the safety inventory that you need to hold here is 329. So if you calculate it over, I think this example has over 10 stores or something like that. The total safety inventory will be 211 units, 1000 units, and you'll be about 526,000 units. And you'll see the value of safety inventory here. Now, so this is the value if you store the inventory individually at each of the stores. Now, if you aggregate it into a centralized distribution center, you'll notice that the value of safety inventory, you can do the same calculations here. You'll end up with 2.632 million here and 394,000 here. That's value in the aggregated inventory. But then again, there are other things that we need to take into account that we don't here. So the total savings will be the difference between 2025 million. How did we get the 25 million? We're not only looking at the value of safety inventory, we're also looking at the difference in holding costs and all of those things. So at the end of the day, the total holding cost saving is 25 million. You divide the 25 million with the annual demand, you'll end up with a holding cost saving. So per unit that you sell, the savings in holding costs is $15.47. So you save $15.47 by aggregating it into a distribution center, as opposed to holding cost savings per unit for a cleaner is only about 4.6 cents. It's much lower. So savings as a percentage of product cost, this will be 3.09%, and this will only 0.15%, right? So higher the coefficient of variation of an item, the greater is the reduction in safety inventories as a result of centralization, right? So that's the key point here. Yeah, right. So when should you specialize? You should specialize for fast. So customers are willing to pay a premium. Then fast-moving, predictable inventory, which is of low value. You should centralize inventories. Otherwise, you should decentralize inventory, especially if the cost is low. If you have slow-moving items, if the cost is low, you should centralize inventories. But if the cost is high, the question is, will the customer be willing to pay a premium for something like that, for slow-moving items? So that's when you have to. That's when the two decisions will end up being made, right? So that is the idea of specialization, right? Now, the next thing that we'll talk about is the idea of product substitution. The product substitution is when you buy one product instead of the other. So there are two different types of product substitution. One is the manufacturer-driven product substitution. Now, this is also a very common thing. Say, for example, you order something. Say you order a laptop that needs to be delivered by a certain amount of time, and you ordered, say, a 1 terabyte hard disk. Now, let's say the manufacturer suddenly realizes that they don't have a 1 terabyte hard disk in their manufacturing facility, so they might just give you a 1.5 terabyte hard disk because they have to get it to you by a certain amount of time. Otherwise, they'll be charged a penalty. So, given that is a substitution that is done by the manufacturer themselves, as opposed to customer-driven substitution. The simple example of this is, let's say that you go to a grocery store and you want to buy 1 gallon jug of, say, milk. But you go there and you find that they only have a half a gallon jug of milk, then you'll buy the half a gallon jug of milk because that is all you have. You'll either buy one or you'll buy two of them, depending upon what you do, but you substitute one product for the other. So it can be done by the manufacturer or it can be done by the customer themselves. So in either case, you have product substitution, and that can play a role in whether or not you centralize inventories, right? So manufacturer-driven substitution increases overall profitability for manufacturer by allowing for some aggregation of demand. So that's something to keep in mind. And as far as customer-driven substitution is concerned, recognition of customer-driven substitution and joint management of inventories across all the different substitutable products allows for a supply chain to reduce the required safety inventory. Now, one of the examples that we will see for this is the idea of postponement, which we'll talk about in one of the later videos. So, but this is the idea of product substitution. So instead of buying one product, you end up buying a different product, right? So you could go for, say, you want to buy a Tide detergent, but you end up buying a different brand detergent because you are in a hurry and you need it. So that's another example of customer-driven substitution, right? So this is the shortest video, but I'm going to end it here. So in this video, we talked about the idea, the value, the impact of coefficient of correlation on aggregation, and we talked about the idea of product substitution, right? So in the next video, we'll talk about the idea of component commonality, and then we'll talk about postponement, right? So I'm going to continue this in the next video, right? Take care.